Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the land of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, who are the traditional custodians. But I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of various lands on which we all work and meet today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are participating in this webinar. I pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and it's celebrate the diversity of Aboriginals and their ongoing cultures and connection to lands and waters. I'm talking about migrating data into Vernon. I thought I'd just quickly introduce the National Art Archive. We are an archive that's part of the collection at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. We are both a collecting archive and the gallery's institutional archive, which means that we are the custodians of those assets that the gallery creates that are deemed under the New South Wales State Records as retained for state archives or deemed significant for archives. We've just undergone a big new refurbishment. So as you can see on the right-hand side, that's what the archive used to look like, or the library and archive back in 72. And this is a new picture on the right-hand side of the new archive and library space. Before I go on and share my stories on using the XML import for two example archives, I'd like to share an archival theory that still stands as a founding concept for modern archive arrangement, and that's respect to fonds. It was first articulated in 1841. This principle proposes to group collections of archival records according to their fonds. The internal structures of a collection ought to be respected to maintain the original order. So the two example archives I'll be talking to you about today is the John Cowdell and Cowdell Public Art Project Archive. This is a physical and born digital archive, which contains various formats and media types. And the archive has already been arranged and described. The Cowdell, which I'm also going to refer to as KPAP, they were using a SaaS collection management system called Collective Access to manage their archive. KPAC also received government funding to digitise their physical collection, which was done through New South Wales State Records digitisation services. So the actual digital surrogates were to a pretty good preservation standard. Part of the grant was also to create the KPAP archive online, which is still up and running. Part of the arrangement of the donation of the KPAP archive included the transfer archival metadata and the digital surrogates of physical collections. The transfer of these would enable the process of archives to be faster, saving resources in describing the archive from scratch, and speed up the process of making these records and their digital surrogates accessible through the gallery's online collection discovery platform. The second archive that I'll be touching on today, and I'm just going to be touching on it, I won't go into too much detail because I'm still working on it, is the Gallery Pom Pom Archive. There's only about 2 boxes of physical records and objects that were part of the archive, but there are over 15,000 board digital records that are primarily organisational records. These records are well structured in a file plan and folder structure. Cowdell Public Art Project Archive. So the main objectives of this archive was to maintain the original order of the KPAP archive, establish relationships between KPAP archive and the objects in the art collection, and that's including artworks and other archival materials in different archives. Maintain relationships between entities, that's people, organisations and events. So the transferred KPAP data will be maintained and archived as a primary source data set. A copy of the data set will be used for remediation and importing into Vernon. Future transfers of KPAP archives will be added to the KPAP archive. The transferred digital assets on digital and digital surrogates will be preserved and made accessible internally and externally via the Art Gallery online collection platform. Altogether, there's 10,756 item-level object records that sit in 36 KPAP individual projects. Due to the volume of records being created, the project data, so the 36 projects within the KPAP archive, will be imported as separate batches. It's a phased approach in migrating the metadata into Vernon and also the digital assets. Stage 1 would be the metadata import. I sort of divided it into steps where the first step is some preliminary analysis and preparations. The second step is creating the XML configuration template and the XML import spreadsheet. What are we receiving and where is it going? The remediation of data and building data sets for import using the XML import spreadsheet. Then step 4 is the XML import and then cross-checking before publishing metadata online. Stage 2, I won't go into too much detail, but that's about the transfer of the digital surrogates, important digital assets. And there's a couple of steps that I've sort of thinking up in advance. So just a breakdown of some of the steps. So the preliminary work involved mapping KPAP archival levels to the Vernon archival levels. It also involved crosswalking the KPAP metadata schema to Vernon fields, and then mapping taxonomies and gallery authority terms. One of the more resource-intensive parts of the project was the verification of KPAP entities, the names of people and organisations. They had not as many as the Auckland Museum, but there's 1,769 names of people and organisations in the KPAP archive. I used the Vernon Pace Quietly in-person list search to find entities that matched in Vernon. Out of the 1,769 KPAP entities, there was a match of 137, which meant there was a whole heap that couldn't be verified. When cross-referencing actually the results that came back, there were only about 550 that were accurate and were true matches to the authorities that we had in Vernon. This meant that there was a lot of work in creating new authorities. At first, I started to go through the missing authorities and double-checking the Vernon names authorities using various spellings. I even started creating new authorities one by one, but found that this was too resource-intensive. I didn't have the time or people power to go through and create over 1,200 odd new name authority records. The alternative to this was to import person name authorities using the XML importer. So this would have minimal data, and it's required by our rights team in sorting through collection licenses and rights processes to have contact information within that names authority. So at the moment, I'm just tackling the names authority by each batch import that I'm doing. Preliminary work also involved reviewing the metadata fields that needed to be remediated so they meet the National Archives content standards. This included how we title things in Vernon, such as the series and sub-series and file levels of description, and obviously the items. With some metadata fields, they weren't to our standards, so new titles needed to be devised with minimal intervention. Dates also needed to be reformatted to Vernon content standards. KPAP also included the creators and dates and titles and descriptions, which meant that these needed to be separated out of those fields. We also looked at the accession number, and instead of minting a new accession number for the collection, we kept the KPAP accession number format, and we just added a prefix, which is our archive collection number, which you can sort of see there in the second snippet. This is an example of what a record looks like, or a project record looks like, on the Caldor Public Art Project's online archive. You can see the data is pretty well structured. We've mapped the project level records to a series. So we'll have a group level record that describes the whole KPAP archive. And then for each project, and there's 36 of them, there'll be series level records. And then we would have sub-series, file, and then down to an item level record. This is an example from the KPAP digital archive of an item level record. As you can see, there's a date in the title field for the item. There's also creator names and descriptions, which we don't usually put. There's the wrong date format for Vernon import. And they also list the entities, but they actually don't define who the entities are. From the description, we understand that Emma is the creator, but then we sort of assume that Jonathan and Bendigo Pottery are the subjects of the image. It's a bit hard when you're looking at a large data set to actually define who those roles are. The second step was creating the XML configuration and the XML import spreadsheet template. So based on the preliminary findings, I included all the data fields in the XML configuration. that were to be added. That also included all the static text. This is consistent data that goes across all records that we add to Vernon, such as the credit line. Then I started creating the XML import spreadsheet template. So using the XML import spreadsheet with the macro to convert data into XML file, created the columns for each data field that will be imported. I also found out that you could actually export the table from the XML import configuration to help build your XML spreadsheet for importing. This is some stages that I did. I was able to export the contents of the table and then use the element text field and transpose it into a row. And then from there, I was able to identify the fields that would be imported. Anything that's in pink that you can see here is the static text. So I would remove that from the XML import spreadsheet, and anything green are the fields that I would be keeping for the XML import spreadsheet. So step 3 was the remediation and building of data sets for import using XML spreadsheet. Copying of transferred data using a working spreadsheet to clean and remediate data. And then part of that was to formalise the titles, reformat dates, do the basic cleanup of the data, and also maintaining the system IDs and accession numbers from KPAP in the other ID field. I used Excel filters and the functions within Excel to help clean up the data. OpenRefine was another tool that I had used in previous cleanup jobs, but I didn't really find it necessary in some of this work. I used the VLOOKUP function in Excel to import the authority SIDs from Vernon names dataset to my working spreadsheet. And then once I had cleaned up the fields within the working spreadsheet, I would then copy them over to the XML import spreadsheet template, and then replacing any Vernon authority terms with the SIDs. And then once that was done, I sort of generated the XML file. Here you can see what the working spreadsheet looks like. So I sort of maintained the data that they gave us in one column. The next column, I would have the cleanup data. Anything in yellow is what they've supplied, and anything in green is what I've done to clean up the data. And then importing, once I've cleaned up the data, that information into the XML import spreadsheet, and using the VLOOKUP function to get the SIDs for the authorities that were in Vernon. So the next step, and this is probably a very important thing, before you start adding item level records, is making sure that the parent record or the next higher record is actually in Vernon. So you need to match that child record to the parent record. I would update the XML configuration with the XML file path, perform the XML import, and then obviously watch records being created and act on any alerts. Sometimes there were a few alerts going, this is the wrong date format. What do you want to do? So it's sort of watching that, which is a bit time consuming. And then obviously saving the imported list to the portfolio as a reference. So cross-checking once everything had been imported into Vernon. So export the imported data and save all the levels of description for the project. I would export the project once it was imported in, and then I would cross-check that data with the KPAC data to make sure that all the levels of description were aligned and there weren't any errors. Obviously fix any errors if required. And then the last thing is to make the metadata available for public access, which is saying we're not quite there yet. So we're in the process of getting a new Archives Online discovery platform. And then once that's up and running, we can go through and start flagging records for public access. Okay, now I'm going to briefly go through my approach in dealing with the transfer of Born Digital Archives. So Gallery Pom-Pom. First thing was, again, having it as a phased approach. So the first phase was the transfer of the archive, metadata extraction and creating Vernon records. And then the second stage that we're not there yet with is the preservation and access of those digital files. So I'll just be talking to you about steps 1 and 2. So securely transfer of digital assets to the archive, and data analysis, metadata extraction and mapping to Vernon fields. So the first step was securely transfer of Born digital records and assets for analysis and staging. So obviously running malware and virus checks over the files that were on an external drive before migration to a server, extracting files from the storage with a write blocker using TerraCopy, and then storing those files on a backed up server whilst performing analysis and staging for preservation. The second part is the interesting part, using duplicate file finder to check if there were any duplicate assets that were included in the transfer. We don't want to have duplicate records in Vernon, and we don't want duplicate assets in our preservation system. Fortunately, there are no duplicate assets with this transfer. I then used an application called Directory List Print and Pro. This is a software that enables you to extract and export embedded metadata from files such as EXIF, IPTC, and XMP data. These metadata fields will be used for the building blocks in creating object records. This table shows you some of the embedded metadata fields that I'll be using and mapping to Vernon data fields for record creation. So this is just a couple of snippets of Directory List Print and Pro, where you can actually see all the different types of embedded metadata fields available, and then being able to export those data fields that will be used for the building blocks of creating object records. So that's something that's still in train and I'm still working on. So thanks for your time. Thanks for listening. You can always get in touch if you want to share some stories. Happy to give advice.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Another huge project with many, many moving parts, a lot of decisions to be made, lots of things to track in terms of where are up to, and all of that mapping work. Again, seeing the XML import function being used was really good. I have a question around like the number of people involved. So you've obviously done the majority of the work. Did you have anybody else involved?
No.
Yeah.
So we're really under-resourced. And there is other business as usual that obviously gets in the way of like being able to just dedicate time to one thing. Yeah.
And so what would be your words of advice for anyone who was thinking of taking on a similar project?
Yeah, getting to know some of the tools to help you clean up the data. I mean, the mapping is pretty easy part of it, mapping the schemas between different systems, but knowing, that there's such things as OpenRefine out there, knowing how to use like different types of filters and searches in Excel to clean up your data. Yeah. And just doing it in stages. So within KPAP, there is the 36 projects, and I'm just importing one project at a time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the largest projects has, I think, 900 item records, which isn't that much compared to what Auckland's been working on, Auckland Museum. But yeah, just doing a phased approach. Yeah.